Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to be explaining you about the movement into and out of the cell. Now we have learned that a cell is a basic primary, the most fundamental unit that makes up these complex organisms such as humans, mammals, amphibians, and birds, fish, and so forth. So these cells need a specific way in which they are a specific mechanism in which they can kind of transfer their produces such as their products and substances in and out of the cell. So they need to be constantly doing that so that homeostasis is maintained. Basically, the maintenance of the body, the regulation, the equilibrium, right, between inside the cell and outside the cell, so the cell can thrive in a kind of a very nurturing environment. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is diffusion. Now remember, diffusion is basically the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, i.e. down a concentration gradient. Now, diffusion is most easiest to imagine or to conceptualize if you kind of imagine, let's say, take a perfume for example. A perfume is a very classic example on which the principles of diffusion works. So let's say that you have a bottle of perfume. Now this perfume, you're gonna spray it so the perfume spreads around the room. But notice that one side of the room where you initially spread it has high concentration of that perfume. Now on the other side of the room, there is low concentration of it, or in other words, there are almost little to none of those perfume particles. Now the principle of diffusion is that the particles are going to move from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. So essentially, the net movement is going to be from high to low. Now note that this does not mean that the particles do not move sideways, do not move from low to high. They do. But the net movement is that the emphasis is the net movement, right? The net movement of particles, of these perfume particles, or any particles as a matter of fact, can move from high to low concentration. Now they are moving in lower concentration, but there is a higher proportion of particles that are moving from high to low concentration. And this is why we state diffusion as the net movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Now this is down a concentration gradient because you go from high to low, you're going down the concentration gradient. And you have to remember this definition. Okay. But secondly, we have to know, how does the energy from diffusion come from? Where does the energy for diffusion come from? Well, it turns out that the energy for diffusion comes from the kinetic energy, or the KE, kinetic energy of the random movement of molecules and ions. Now what I've just said is that the energy, right, for diffusion to take place, there must be an energy. So this energy comes from the kinetic energy of the random movement of molecules and ions. Remember, when there is movement, there is always kinetic energy. So essentially, when particles move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, they do move, and therefore this kinetic energy is providing for the fusion to be able to take place. Now that's essentially the same idea, and you have to know that the energy from the fusion comes from the kinetic energy of the molecules that are moving randomly. Okay. Now, thirdly, I want to touch upon the fact that some substances move into and out of the cell by diffusion through the cell membrane. Right, they move through the cell membrane. So, moving substances in and out of cell membrane. I'm going to write it as a short form, cell membrane. There are essentially two ways of moving from cell membrane, from in and out, or out from the outside to the inside of cell membrane. Now, one of these methods is by using diffusion, where the particles or molecules or ions can diffuse directly into or out of the cell membrane. This is the first factor. A second factor is that active transport plays a very huge role in moving substances, such as mineral ions in plants' roots. So essentially, there are two methods of moving substances. It's either via diffusion or active transport. Active transport. So now diffusion is a passive process, and you should be able to describe this. And active transport is an active process, just like the name suggests, because it needs energy. ATP is required. Energy is required for this kind of method, so that you can move substances in and out of the cell membrane. Okay, now you have to be able to know why diffusion is important. So diffusion is really important on several factors. Well, for instance, we have lungs in our bodies. These lungs are going to exchange gases with the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide from the air and oxygen from the air. We are going to exchange. We're going to take in oxygen. We're going to take out carbon dioxide. So diffusion is really important in these cases in which the small molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to diffuse in the bloodstream, away from the bloodstream, right, from the capillaries, specifically in the alveoli, right? So that is why diffusion is really important. If there is no diffusion, well, then gases and solutes will be contained in that one area, and so that the gases cannot move freely, right? So diffusion will always take place, and that is really important as well. And as I've said, living organisms like us, mammals, we need to constantly eat, right? So how do we remove waste products? Some animals do in fact remove these waste products by diffusion. We also do. We remove a product called sweat. When we get really hot, our skin releases these sweat molecules, and these sweat molecules are also waste product, and they actually diffuse out of our skin and into the atmosphere. It is waste product that is done by diffusion. And this is only one of the several examples that I will be giving you. They need to obtain nutrients via diffusion as well, such as I've said, oxygen from the lungs, right? And carbon dioxide could also be a prime example of nutrient when we talk about plants, right? In plants. Now, carbon dioxide, remember, is needed for photosynthesis, right? It's one of the raw products that is needed for photosynthesis, right? And oxygen molecules. So, right, this is why diffusion is really important. Okay, let's move on. But what are the factors that actually affect diffusion? Now there are several factors which affect diffusion, and here are some of the things that you have to know. Now firstly, if we increase the surface area, so imagine you are in your kitchen, you go to your mom and ask your mom, you see your mom cutting down or frying up something. So she basically, let's say she's cutting up tofu, right? A tofu, she's going to make fried tofu. Now this tofu is initially a very huge slab, a very huge material. Then she's going to cut this tofu into several tiny little pieces. Now if you were to put the whole tofu, fry whole tofu at once, or if you cut it down into tiny pieces and if you fry it in tiny little pieces, you will notice that the small little tofus actually are more faster to fry, right? This is basically the same as diffusion. If you increase the surface area, the rate of diffusion will also increase. Now, I know the tofu example might not be that conceptual. It could be a little bit difficult to conceptualize. So, I'm going to give another example. So, a classic example of this surface area is our clothes. When you hang your clothes to dry, you would often hang it out, fully like this. You will fully hang the clothes out. You would not fold the clothes and then hang it out. Now this is because there is larger surface area. So the water molecules that is soaked in your shirt can actually diffuse out way more faster than if you were to use a lower surface area, or basically a folded shirt. Now this is the same principle, surface area. So if we increase the surface area, the diffusion rate will also increase. Now the second factor which affects diffusion is temperature. Now using the same example that I have given, the same clothes example, if we were to use a higher temperature, the clothes will obviously dry faster. Now why do they dry faster? Well, if you give heat, the water molecule vibrates, it has more kinetic energy to leave the surface of your clothes, so it becomes more drier. It becomes faster to dry. So if you increase the temperature, the rate of diffusion also increases. And vice versa, if you use low temperature, lower rate of diffusion. Now, the third factor which is affecting this is the concentration gradient. Now, once again, I'll also use the same clothing analogy for you. So imagine the clothes that you hang are on different days. One of the days happen to be raining, and the other day when you hang the clothes, it's not raining, it is sunny. So if it's raining, there is a high water potential or high water molecule of water vapor in the air. So, and obviously your clothes are also wet, the atmosphere is also wet. So there isn't that much of a steep gradient, right? There isn't much of a difference between the atmosphere, the water potential in the atmosphere and the water potential in your shirt. So we say that there is less concentration gradient. And where it is less concentration gradient, basically when the gradient is less steep, we can say that the diffusion rate will also decrease. Now, on the other hand, if you were to hang your clothes on a sunny day, the clothes will dry faster. Why? Because the clothes are wet, has high water potential, and the air is very humid, very dry. It doesn't have that much water molecules, right? The air is really dry. So there is a high difference between the water potential in the atmosphere and inside the clothes. And this we say there is a steep gradient. And if there is a steep gradient, the diffusion rate increases. So steep concentration gradient you say is going to increase diffusion, right? And that's one of the factors as well. Now, the third factor which affects diffusion is distance. Now, distance is also another factor because if a classic example for explaining distance is inside your alveoli, inside the air sacs in your lungs. These are alveoli, basically air sacs. Now on the alveoli, there are tiny little blood vessels called capillaries. And it is in these capillaries in which gas exchange takes place. Now one of these features, special features of these capillaries turns out that these capillaries are actually really thin. Its diameter is really thin. So essentially its distance is also thin. Now this means that the diffusion rate is going to increase because, right, diffusion will always increase if the distance is less. However, if the distance is large between you and if the capillaries were not used as the blood vessel to exchange gas, then the distance would essentially be, the rate of diffusion would essentially be really slow, right? So all you have to remember is thinner walls, thinner distance or less distance equals greater rate of diffusion. Now you could also use the perfume analogy for this as well, if you are not clear with this alveoli analogy. So the perfume, right? You are standing in one corner of the room, and the room is 5 meters long, and you spray the perfume. And if your friend stands on the other side of the room, from the moment you spray the perfume, your friend is going to smell it faster because the rate of diffusion is faster. Now, on the other hand, if you and your friend are in a 10-meter room, in which the distance is 10 meters, and when you spray the perfume, it will take a longer time for the perfume particles to reach your friend's nose. So we say that the greater the distance, the less diffusion, and the less distance there is, less distance, higher diffusion, more distance, less diffusion. Less diffusion as in the rate of diffusion. Okay. And another factor that could potentially affect diffusion is the wind speed. Now this is also, we can also explain this by looking at the clothing analogy, in which that the clothes, when you hang a clothes on a windy day, the wind is going to blow the water particles away. So therefore diffusion rate is going to be faster on those days, right? So wind speed is directly proportional to the rate of diffusion as well. So right, those are all you need to know for diffusion. Next, I want to explain something called osmosis. Now osmosis, you have to know the definition of osmosis. The osmosis is basically the net movement, right? The net movement of water molecules from a region of higher water potential to region of lower water potential, and this is down the water potential gradient. Right, notice that osmosis is basically a special form of diffusion. It's basically a special form of diffusion. It is also a passive way of moving substances. It's a special form of diffusion, right? Special form as in water molecule. Osmosis only occurs in water molecules. Now this is the same as diffusion from higher water potential to lower water potential, down the water potential gradient. Now a very key thing that you have to notice is that I use water potential to describe my answer. So if you were to given this in a test, you would have to use the correct term, water potential. Right. You cannot say water concentration because it is not scientifically correct if you say water potential or water concentration. Right. So please do take note of that. Okay. And when we talk about osmosis, water has to move substances in and out of a sol, because if a sol is submerged inside a water, then different things could happen. Different effect could happen based on the water potential of the solution in which you place the sol in. Now, we have to know that water diffuses through a partially permeable membrane by osmosis. So when water moves, it moves via osmosis always through a partially permeable membrane. Now that's something that you have to know as well. It can move in and out, right? It can move, H2O can move in and out of a sol. That's something you have to know as well. Now, a higher water potential, if we think about it, a higher water potential means inside of that solution, particular solution, the solution is going to be really dilute, right? The dilute solution. Now, if we think about the lower water potential thing, we can say that there is less water molecules there. There's more water molecules in that solution, which means it is dilute. If there's lower water potential, there is less water molecule inside there. We see it is a concentrated solution. Right. And so you have to know the different effects of those solutions which affect the plant cell. Now let's first look at the plant tissue. Let's immerse a plant cell. So figure 1 shows that a plant has been, this cell has been submerged inside a solution, concentrated inside pure water. Now if there is pure water, remember pure water is always has a higher water potential than any substances that you submerge it in. Even if the cell itself already has a lot of water, pure water will always have a higher water molecule count or water molecule potential than a cell. So remember, if you place this inside pure water, then the water is going to go from pure water inside the cell. Now what does this do? This makes the plant cell look very turgid. Now we can describe it as turgid as, we can say that it is bloated, almost, if we describe it in human kind of way. So yeah, we use the scientific term turgid. The plant cell has become turgid when you put it inside pure water or inside a dilute. This is inside a dilute solution. Okay, so pure water will move in, right? So as we said, water moves in cell via osmosis through the cell membrane, right? So the cytoplasm vacuole will kind of become bloated, or we say it will swell up, right? However, plant cells have strong cell walls. We have to note that cell walls prevent cells from bursting, right? And that's something really important that you have to note. The cell walls are really strong, which means even if the cell membrane is expanding, pushing pushing against the cell wall is strong enough to maintain its shape so that the cell itself does not burst. Okay, figure 2 shows a cell when the water solution, when the solution, the water potential in the solution and the water potential in the cell, is equal. So you can see that it's not turgid. It's not turgid at all. It's not turgid. It is just simply as it is, right? So water, the net movement is not going anywhere, right? Water is not going anywhere because they are equal. There is no concentration gradient. No H2O gradient. So in this case, no osmosis occur. Now the third picture here shows a plant cell that is placed inside a concentrated solution. A concentrated solution, remember, means there is lower water potential. If there is lower water potential, then if you put it inside a lower water potential, we say that, and the cell obviously going to have a higher water potential. The cell is going to have a higher water potential than the outside. So remember, osmosis always moves from the higher water potential to lower water potential. So in this case, we can say that water moves out from cell into solution via osmosis. Now notice that the plant cell wall, the cell membrane is shrinking. The vacuole itself is also shrinking. The vacuole is also shrinking, so we can say that the cell membrane is shrinking. The vacuole is also shrinking, right? In other words, we can describe this state as flaccid, in which it has become like almost like a deflated balloon, right? We can say it is flaccid. Now that's a very important key term, flaccid. Now figure 4 shows a plant cell when you put it inside a very, very concentrated solution. If you put the plant cell in even more concentrated solution, it means there's a higher or steeper water potential gradient, right? H2O potential gradient. If there is a higher gradient, the water inside the cell is obviously higher, the water outside the cell is obviously much lower than the previous example of number 3, then the water is going to move even more than 3. So the cell is going to become really, really flaccid. It becomes really flaccid. And right, as I said, the cell membrane shrinks, the cytoplasm also shrinks, right? Cytoplasm shrinks, the vacuole shrinks as well. So we call this state when it is put inside when the cytoplasm is pulled away from the cell wall. We call this state plasmolysed. So the cell has become plasmolysed if the cytoplasm is pulled away from the cell wall. Now I'm going to help you illustrate this. So the cytoplasm is going to be pulled away. Right, this is the cytoplasm surrounding. It's pulled away from the cell wall. Whereas in example number 3, the cytoplasm does not move at all. It's only the membrane which is shrinking. Right. So in number 3, we cannot say that the cell has been plasmolysed, but in number 4, the cytoplasm itself is shrinking. This means it has become plasmolysed. Plasmolysed. Right. So this is all for the plant cells. Now we do have to know what happens in animal cells as well. Animal cells. Now a very classic example to look at is the RBC, the red blood cell. So one thing we have to note before we go on is that unlike plant cells, right, they do not have strong cell walls. This means that the cell walls absent, therefore cannot support the cell from bursting out. Right, so red blood cells will burst if you put them inside a really, really high concentration. So red blood cells I'll draw it like this. If you put it inside a really high concentration, it's going to burst out like this. It's really going to burst out like this. This is plasmolized. This is a Reblozyl that is bursted. Right, and this happens in a concentrated solution because the water potential in the Reblozyl is higher than the water potential outside. Remember, we are using a concentrated solution, so water is going to move from high to low once again by osmosis, and Reblozyl is burst. Now, this is the reason of this is because the cell wall is absent. Now, if we put the Reblozyl inside a solution in which the water potential is the same, in other words, the Reblozyl water potential has to be equal to the water potential in solution, then the Reblozyl will not burst. It will not become turgid at all. It will just stay the same, right? Now, if we put it inside a weak solution, right? If we put it inside a weak solution, so if we put it inside a weak solution, and where we put it, if we put this inside a very weak solution, the water is going to enter, right? If we put it inside a weak solution, the water is going to, a weak solution or a dilute solution, right? So a dilute solution means there is high water potential. This means water is going to go from the solution to inside the cell. So the cell is going to swell up, then eventually it will burst. Okay. Now, for the concentrated solution, I forgot to mention that it will burst, but it will burst because the water is going outwards. It goes outside of this Reblozyl. It leaves the Reblozyl into the solution, and it bursts almost like in the spiky shape. It does burst, but not in the way of, it does not swell up, right? It does not swell up and burst, unlike the dilute solution. So yeah, you should be able to know that as well. This is for animal cells and Reblozyls. Okay. And you should be able to use these terms called turgid, right, in pencils. You should be able to use turgor pressure. Now, turgor pressure is basically the pressure that is exerted, right? Pressure exerted by cell wall, cell membrane, or the cytoplasm against the cell wall. So this happens in plant cell when you put it inside pure water, right? Now this is something you have to know. You have to use these terms because these are the key to getting full marks in the exam. You should be able to know how to use plasmolysis. This is when the plasmolysis is basically the shrinkage of cytoplasm. Okay, you should be able to use flaccid. Flaccid happens when water leaves the cell, right? It becomes really flaccid. This happens in concentrated solution. Now this is just to recap everything that I have just explained. Okay. And you have to know that cell walls play a very huge role in determining whether the cell bursts or not. Now, as we have said, the plant cells are never permanently damaged because of its strong cellular cell wall. Plant cells never burst, i.e. it is not damaged permanently, right? And for animal cells, however, if they are put inside a solution that is very weak, inside the dilute solution, it will swell up and burst. If you put it inside a very concentrated solution, it will also burst, right? So it is permanently damaged, and you cannot do that. So This is why the body is really important. Your body is trying to maintain a very good solution in which the red blood cell can be put in so that they don't actually burst out. That's why it's kind of a mechanism that your body does, right? It controls the pH levels inside your blood and the concentration of the water potential of your blood. And that's a very important factor as well. Right. So I believe I have explained everything. Oh wait, I still have to touch on one more thing. Active transport, right. Now active transport, I'm gonna write it in a short form. Active transport is basically the movement of particles from a region of lower to high. Now this is the opposite of diffusion. This is an active process, as the name suggests. Movement of particles from a region of low to high concentration, basically against a concentration gradient. Now we are going we're going up a gradient against a concentration gradient. Now this happens when plants absorb mineral ions. For example, the cells in the root of the plant, when they absorb the mineral ions from the soil, they're really, really greedy. They want to have as much as mineral ions as possible. Now this is done by active transport. So it goes from a very low concentration where there's low minerals in the soil, to high concentration of minerals in plants. In other words, plants are just really, really greedy creatures, right? And so this could be mineral ion uptake, right? And the things that are actually helping the molecules move the mineral ions, right? Uptake, the things that are actually helping the plant to absorb or to take in the mineral ions are basically proteins. Now proteins play a very important role in this. Now these are called protein carriers, right? They can be a transport protein, right? A transport protein. It could be a channel protein as well. But I don't think you have to know about these because these are not mentioned in your syllabus. However, protein carriers you do have to know. They are the ones which move molecules or ions across a membrane during active transport. And I just want to emphasize that active transport is an active process. It requires energy manually, right? It requires energy, and this energy comes in the form of ATP. Now ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You'll learn this later on next year. So yeah, so these are everything that you have to know about the movement of into and out of the cell. Now I hope you do understand every single thing that I try to explain. If there are some analogies that I explained it kind of not clearly, then you can please leave a comment down below. I would love to help you clear your doubts. Anyways, thank you for watching once again. These videos do take a lot of time to produce, and right, Merry Christmas.